What's up, everybody? I feel like every so often we need to come in here, take a deep breath, calm things down, and just kind of zoom out a bit and look at the bigger picture. Because something major that I have noticed is that every time I've adapted my talking points in order to counter the arguments that are made by people that think that the Switch 2 is going to be the best thing since sliced bread, they tend to quickly shift the narrative and move the goalposts in ways that you just kind of don't expect. This all obviously started prior to the console's launch, where they were insisting that the Switch 2 was going to sell 6 to 8 million units immediately, and then once the console launched and it took 7 weeks to reach 6 million, during that entire window of time, they all absolutely denied it and pretended that nobody was seriously suggesting it. During that same point in time, the discussion became about supply constraints and how the Switch 2 could only sell what was being delivered. They continued to insist that the Switch 2 would not be remaining on shelves and it would be very difficult to buy one until the end of the holiday season. So naturally, during that time, I started to track sales. That's a big reason why I do track sales and why I track inventory of different companies and what they're posting. And it's a very big reason why I could tell from the sales patterns that the console was easily going to be sitting on shelves by the end of July. At which point, again, they shifted the narrative and they said that just because there are more units being shipped by Nintendo, it doesn't mean the consoles aren't selling. So once again, I started to track the situation with how many consoles were actually purchased before they got to satiated demand, and I even made a video about it indicating that the Nintendo Switch 2 was only at roughly 2.5 million units when that initial launch demand was satiated, significantly lower than what the PlayStation 5 had and the Xbox Series X, and I use those two because those are the most recent consoles. So at that point, they would pivot and they would say, why don't you compare it to the Switch 1 and the PS4, because those are consoles that came out prior to the pandemic. We don't want to compare our consoles to what's coming out in the pandemic. Demand was too high back then. So then I shifted my focus and I started to compare it to what the Switch 1 was doing in 2017. And then we got to the holiday season and the Switch 1 2017 ended up outselling the Switch 2 in both November and December by at least 35% and up to potentially 40%. And now they're circling back and saying, stop focusing on the Switch 1. That was so long ago. If it was so easy to repeat the success of the Switch 1, why haven't Microsoft and Sony done it? And mind you, this is going on with every single topic in relation to this console. Yesterday, people were telling me that the fact that the Switch 2 was able to accomplish what it does without a major title is such a success, because that just tells you how much more this thing is going to grow when the Switch 2 gets a 3D Mario and a 3D Zelda. To which I replied to that comment, yes, that is true. The Switch 2 does not have a good system seller. It'll be interesting to see what happens in the following year, only to be immediately met with a reply from them saying, why do you downplay Mario Kart World as not a system seller and Donkey Kong Bonanza as not being a system seller? Even Pokemon Legends ZA was a system seller. And I'm sure if I continued to engage that discussion, they would even suggest that Kirby and Metroid sold units. So the realization here is that no matter what you bring up as a counterpoint, even if you're agreeing with them, even if you're playing by their rules, as long as they see what they want to see, and what they want to see is fastest selling console, they're not going to be able to fold and be reasoned with on anything. And quite frankly, I've realized this months ago, but I've continued to play by their rules because that's the narrative that goes on online, and I'd like to address all of the talking points that continue to come in. And as long as they keep spinning the wheel and going in circles, I will continue to follow along and spin that same wheel. With the added bonus that I'm seeing clear results that are backing up my talking points, because I just witnessed Nintendo having basically the worst December that it's ever had for a freshly launched console, because even if you consider the years of the Wii U, the sales were still being propped up by the Wii, which was still selling very well, especially in the holiday season, as well as the 3DS, which by that point in time had gotten its price drop and was just running away to success in the West. Add on to that the fact that this is a brand new console, it needed a discount from the retailers because Nintendo didn't want them to discount it, and the fact that this is the Switch 2 coming off of the Switch 1, which had more hype than any other console launch I've ever seen in history, and we are currently sitting in a gaming environment that has more hype and more media and more money and more news than any other game console launch prior to this one. And the Switch 2 is effectively uncontested. It is competing against a 5-year-old PlayStation 5, and even then, the PS5 across November and December still outsold the Switch 2, and it only slightly lost to the Switch 2 in December. This is an underperforming PlayStation 5 year because of its high price point, since it hasn't dropped down below its launch price, that had a better holiday season than a brand new Switch 2 that was dropped $50. And despite that, the Switch 2 could not come out on top of its own holiday season. This is their year. It's supposed to be their year. And at this point, I will pause to allow them to stop the video and go into my comment section and say, yeah, of course this is their year. They were the fastest selling console in the US in 2025. Just please make sure once you make that comment, you come back into the video and finish hearing what I'm saying. In any case, we've circled back to the fastest selling discussion, with the data points showing how far ahead the Switch 2 is compared to the PS4. So now I gotta go back and repeat those talking points. In every single console that is launched, it gets two major bumps. The first bump is that opening sale. That's why almost every single console, when it launches, it breaks some kind of record. Whatever number of units the console manufacturer brought in on that day, they're going to sell it, no matter how high that number is. So I'll tell you this from now, and you can call me a wizard who knows the future. The very next console launch, whether it's the PlayStation 6, the Switch 3, the Xbox Series XYZ, that launch is going to break a record. And I'll tell you from now, it's guaranteed. It's going to have the fastest opening weekend, opening one day, opening month, etc. You know, as long as there's no like major extenuating factors like a worldwide pandemic or some crazy stuff with shipments and supplies and shortages and RAMs and etc. But I'm pretty sure after they all saw what Nintendo just pulled off, they're going to make sure they stockpile and release an extra amount of consoles on that day. But anyway, so that's the first major bump that a console gets. It launches, that you get those first day one buyers, the ones that are the most excited to grab the console. These guys will spend whatever they have to spend. They will camp out overnight for a Wii U. They will buy a PlayStation 3 for $600 even if they can't afford it. They will buy a Switch 2 even though it's just a Switch Pro. They're guaranteed buys. It doesn't matter what the game that's provided with it. It doesn't matter anything else. As long as you launch that thing and you have the units available and they're able to get a hold of it before a scalper or a bot does, they're buying it. And most of the time, it is a scalper or a bot. Now, some consoles actually have that major bump in the holiday season because they launch in the holiday season. A vast majority of home consoles through our lifetime have launched in that holiday season, in November. Almost every single one of these consoles, except for the ones that didn't really succeed as much as you'd have expected, and some of them even absolutely downright failed, sold out every single one of those shipped units by the end of the year, minimum. So whatever they shipped out to the stores in November and in December, those are gone before the casuals can even think about them. It's still enthusiasts picking it up at that point. It's still scalpers, it's still bots. The most successful of those consoles will continue to be out of stock in January and February and sometimes up to even March. So in the case of the Wii, for example, it's still sold out. I remember buying a second Wii a year after the console launched. I think it was almost the end of the summer, so maybe slightly less than a year. I had to show up at 4 in the morning and camp out and wait for Toys R Us to open. This had nothing to do with the pandemic. I remember when I was buying my Nintendo Switch 1, I think I got it in August, I'm pretty sure. I wasn't a day one buyer because, well, I had just gotten married, to be honest, so we were spending a lot of time traveling. And I still wanted her to think I was cool, so I wasn't playing video games. That's a joke, obviously. I just couldn't afford to buy it because we spent the first year and a half of our marriage paying off our student debt. Yay, America. Anyway, in August, I kind of cheated a little bit because we hadn't finished paying off our debt yet, but I was sitting in a construction vehicle out on a construction site during work where there was a lot of downtime and I was reading a lot of books and decided, why would I read books and educate myself? Let me go get a Nintendo console. So I had to track inventory stock in the nearest Best Buy every single day to see when they had something in stock. The Best Buy was 5 minutes away. It took me over a week to be able to get a hold of one. Every time it would say in stock, it sold out immediately. I got lucky. On one of the days, I slid my phone, refreshed the Best Buy page, saw that they had 3 in stock. I called the guy. I told him that I would be there within 5 minutes. Please hold it for me. He told me he would, but I have to be there within 10 minutes. By the time I got there, 2 of those 3 were sold already. And like I said, keep in mind, this is August, like almost 6 months after the console was launched, which according to the data from Circana means that there were more than 2 million out in circulation and it was still this difficult to grab it, unlike the Switch 2. But anyway, I made it to Best Buy. They only had 1 console left. It had the gray Joy-Cons. I wanted the colored ones, but I was stuck with the gray ones. I didn't care. I bought the Switch and I was happy. These are the Nintendo consoles and how difficult it is to grab them prior to the pandemic. And quite frankly, it got easier during the pandemic because there were more units being allocated to buy online than before. But that's besides the point. The idea is that all of these consoles that launch, they get their initial launch hype and that continues until they get to satiated demand. Consoles that launch in November and October do not get that holiday bump. They're still at that initial launch demand. The first true holiday bump comes for those consoles in the following year. So Nintendo realized this fairly early on because they would launch their handheld consoles just throughout the year at a specific time, and that would allow them to have a crap ton of consoles available when the holidays come around, and because they're going to be the easy budget video game console present that a grandparent can buy for their grandchildren, they always have an amazing December and November. It is not a coincidence that the Nintendo Switch 2 absolutely flopped during the holidays this season, because it is the first time that Nintendo approaches the holiday season without having a budget-friendly option. It's actually very obvious, and I'm surprised most people don't understand that, especially when you consider that in December, they managed to sell more units because they got some discounts, and those discounts were minor. But imagine if they had gotten a proper price drop. But anyway, back to focus. So Nintendo did that with their handheld consoles. Not with all of them. The DS launched in November of 2004, for example. And some of them are kind of shifted around because a lot of the launches were staggered, just to make sure they have enough units available for every single console. So also keep that point in mind as well, because part of the reason why the Switch 2 is a record-breaking console is because these other consoles in their first few months were only available in a single region. Once they started doing global launches, obviously the numbers got higher. But obviously that's not only a Nintendo thing, that's just an industry-wide thing in general. But yeah, so like in the States, for example, the 3DS launches in March. The Nintendo Switch launches in March. In the case of the 3DS, the launch seemingly failed. Mind you, in its launch month, it sold out. In the following April, it kind of struggled a little bit, but by the end of the month, they had plenty of units. But it was in May when you felt that biggest drop. In June, the number actually bounced back, but that was because of the launch of Ocarina of Time 3D, but then they quickly saw the number go back down in July. So it was clear to Nintendo by that point in time that if they had stretched this out for another 3 months, August, September, and October, they might end up having one of the worst holiday seasons that you'd ever seen. Now, they didn't exactly need to be as concerned because both the Wii and the DS were still selling well enough to paper over some of the cracks. They probably could have wrote it out, got to the holiday season, and seen where they landed with like the big holiday bump, but they decided to be proactive, and by the time they saw the numbers go down in July, they're like, let's not risk it. We don't want this to be an embarrassing holiday season. This stabilized the 3DS's growth over the span of its first 8 months. And now keep in mind, I didn't mention this earlier, but the 3DS launched on the 27th of March. So you see that 400,000 number that it launched with, that was just the first weekend, basically. Its launch was more or less that whole 398 plus 194. But outside of its launch month, the 3 next best months that it had prior to the holiday season were those months that followed the price drop. And then once it got to the holiday season, it actually not only did significantly better than what the Switch 2 did, it did better than what the original Switch did. So it's actually a 42% drop off from what the 3DS managed in its first holiday season versus what the Switch 2 managed in its first holiday season. If the 3DS had launched in June, I don't think Nintendo would have course corrected, because they would have launched in June, their first 2 months would have burned through with whatever units they had, and then Ocarina of Time would have came out, and it would have been like October, and then they would have gone straight into the holiday season. If that was the case, they would have gambled on the holiday season to see how well the 3DS does in its first holiday. And just like right now, we all talk about how the Switch 2 was a 35% drop-off from its predecessor, back then, people would have talked about how the 3DS was a massive drop-off from its predecessor. But Nintendo saved the 3DS because of that, and they saved it from having an embarrassing, abysmal holiday like the Switch 2 just had. And actually, you can kind of put this in another way. If the Switch 2 had launched back in March, the same way that the 3DS and the Switch 1 did, then by the time they would have made it to the summer, and they would have seen those very slummer months, likewise, the media would have picked up on that, and they would have talked about it, and it would have been spun out and gone ballistic. Because if you think that it was bad when they were trying to push Star Wars Outlaws and then Pokemon only sold 300,000 units, which is the slowest month a Pokemon launch has ever had, you can only imagine how much worse it would have been if they had gotten to the slow summer months and not had that holiday bump because they launched in June. If the Switch 2 had launched in March the same way those other consoles had launched, they never would have gambled on the holiday season. Instead, they were just really hoping to get through it and get in and out unscathed on the other side. And obviously, that's not the case. They've ended up with their worst, most abysmal, embarrassing holiday season that you can possibly imagine for a brand new console with the type of hype that the Switch 2 has. Now, when you compare it to the consoles that launched back in March, those being the 3DS and the Nintendo Switch, no matter how poor and embarrassing that holiday season ends up being for the Switch 2, Nintendo was well aware of the fact that they can always fall back to the fact that it's the fastest selling console by the end of the holiday season. That's almost an inevitability, because it's the only console that would have gotten the holiday bump as well as the launch bump in its first 7 months. No other console can say that unless they launch in June. And as a bit of a side point, the only other console to launch in June, that being the Game Boy Advance, actually ended up outselling the Nintendo Switch 2 across the first 7 months, but they're just conveniently not talking about it. In fact, yesterday I told somebody that it's wrong to refer to the Switch 2 as the fastest selling game console in history because the Game Boy Advance technically holds that title. And I was told that that sounds like pure copium. These are the kind of discussions that we have to have on a daily basis with the people that come to my channel just to spew hate. But the point here is that the reason why the Game Boy Advance holds the title for being the fastest selling console across its first 6 months, and keep in mind, it did this back in 2001 where the gaming industry was much smaller, and of course it did this while it was only $100. But even despite that, the reason why it still outpaced initially all of these massive consoles, including the likes of the DS and the Switch, which would go on and become the fastest selling consoles in history along with the PlayStation 2, the reason why the Game Boy Advance is the fastest selling console in the US across the first 7 months is because it got its launch in June. So it had the launch bump and the holiday bump in its first 7 months. The only other console to also get those 2 bumps in their first 7 months is the Nintendo Switch 2, and the Switch 2 could not even beat the single bit of competition that it had in that first 7 months. And the Game Boy Advance struggled to have supply available in its first 7 months. The Switch 2 has had full shelves stocked since July. So here is what is going to happen as things move forward. Those very slow summer months that the 3DS had experienced that caused Nintendo to drop the price, even though they launched Ocarina of Time, basically your May and June and July, that's going to be reflected with the Switch 2 in January, February, and March. During that same amount of time, the Nintendo Switch is going to have reached its first holiday season. Unless I am completely wrong about January, February, and March, there is very little chance that the Switch 2 is still ahead of the Switch by that point in time. And if it is ahead of the Switch, it's going to be marginal. And I think that's a best case scenario for the Switch 2 in the next 3 months. We'll have to see how that plays out, and obviously this is with the assumption that there won't be any discounts or price drops. Once the numbers start to come down for the prices, there's a potential difference there. Now, in the case of the 3DS, even if the Switch 2 sells 0 for the next 3 months, the 3DS will not catch up to the Switch 2. This is because of how slow the poor summer months were for the 3DS leading up to that holiday season drop in price. But it should be noted, when you compare the 3DS and the Switch 1 and the Switch 2, by the end of their first December for all 3 consoles, the Switch 2 is roughly 10% behind the Switch 1 and only 7.5% ahead of the 3DS. So right now, if you're rounding, it's closer to the 3DS than it is to the Switch 1. And the 3DS's second holiday was a decline from its first holiday, but it still is at roughly 22% ahead of the Switch 2's first holiday. So if things remain for the Switch 2 as they were last year, and they continue on to the same trend going forward in the following year with no crazy fixes to fix the situation with the Switch 2 and allow them to have a respectable bump like they had in their first month and a half, if the 3DS ends up spending the entire year up to October still behind the Switch 2, by the time they get to November, 100%, there is almost zero chance it will not surpass the Switch 2 in that holiday season. So that will be the Switch and the 3DS both surpassing the Switch 2 within a year and a half, if things stay as they remain. Now, those are just the Nintendo consoles. Let's look at the PlayStation 4. In its first month, the Nintendo Switch 2 outpaced the PlayStation 4 by almost 30%. But the PlayStation 4 had a stronger second month than the Switch 2 did in July, almost doubling what the Nintendo Switch 2 did in its second month. In the case of the PlayStation 4, through its first 2 months, it was still severely supply constrained. Even though it was a November and December launch, nobody was buying it for the holidays, it was people buying it because of that initial launch demand. So by the end of the Switch 2's second month, it still outpaced the PlayStation 4, but in July there were significantly more Switch 2s still available, whereas the PlayStation 4 sold out everything that it shipped out through that holiday season. And the total difference between the two consoles was all of 79,000 units. It was very close, and I talked about it back then too. I'm like, yo, it was like, if the Sony had just shipped out like half a shipment, Nintendo would not have been able to keep the pace ahead of that console. Now, the PlayStation 4 did not meet satiated demand until around March or April, and I have a video where I discussed when each console met its satiated demand. I did a lot of research for this video. You can watch it if you don't believe me. This is effectively when the stock became unlimited, where you could just buy one at any store you go into. By that point in time, the PlayStation 4 was at 2.912 units sold. Effectively, it sold every single PlayStation that it had delivered by then. Like, it cannot get any higher than that. And this coincided with the Nintendo Switch 2's October, which was a month with a Pokemon launch. So the PlayStation 4, by the end of its 5th month, effectively supply constrained, sold out every single console that it had shipped up to that point in time, had reached only 78,000 units fewer than what the Switch 2 sold, with zero supply constraints and a Pokemon launch, putting the Switch 2 at less than 3% ahead of the PlayStation 4 going into the holiday season. And then obviously what ends up happening from there is that the PS4 continues on a regular mid-year March, April, May trajectory, but the Switch 2 gets its holiday bump. So now it will remain outpacing the PlayStation 4 until later on this year. But the PlayStation 4 had a steady stream of units being sold all throughout the year, similar to the 3DS. Once again, as long as Nintendo continues on this same trajectory and does not turn the ship around somehow and do something impressive similar to what they did in its first month, it will absolutely be overtaken by the PlayStation 4 by the end of the year. Because the PlayStation 4, by the time it got to that first December, sold almost 1.9 million units, which would be 26% more units sold in its first major December with no supply constraints, in comparison to the embarrassingly low holiday season that Nintendo just saw with their Switch 2. Now, fortunately, we should not have to wait until the holiday season for them to stop saying launch is aligned, Switch 2 is the fastest selling console, because it will be surpassed by the Switch 1 very soon. And if you would like, absolutely you can keep correcting them and say that the Game Boy Advance is actually the fastest selling console, because it is. The Game Boy Advance is objectively the fastest selling console in US history through the first 7 months, launch is aligned. From now until the end of time, the Switch 2 will never be the fastest selling console, as long as you count the Game Boy Advance. And that is a completely valid argument to make against them anytime they mention it, if you would like. Because here's the reality, in a few months from now, when the Switch 1 inevitably surpasses the Switch 2, you can already see what they're starting to say right now. They're like, why are you comparing it to the Switch 1? It was such a massive success. Nobody expects the Switch 2 to sell as much as the Switch 1. So even by that point in time, they're going to shift the goalpost and they're going to start talking about how it's still ahead of the PlayStation 4. And by the end of the holiday season, the 3DS and the PlayStation 4 are going to surpass it, and they're going to do what they did back in November. They're going to start comparing it to what the PlayStation 5 is currently doing and what the Xbox Series X, how it flopped now, suggesting that this market is very different. So I don't know if it's worth it to even try to play by their rules, but I'm going to continue to do so because even when playing by their rules, they're losing. Nintendo's losing, and their fans are losing. The Switch 2 right now is not the fastest selling console in the US through its first 7 months, and it never will be again, because it's never going to catch up to the Game Boy Advance. And if it does eventually surpass the Game Boy Advance, by then the Switch 1 will have overtaken it, and probably the PS4 as well. But as it stands, it's already not the fastest selling console. It's a handheld, and the Game Boy Advance was also a handheld, and the Game Boy Advance is ahead of it. But as long as they continue to discredit the Game Boy Advance, here's the only 2 arguments that they can continue to make, and they only got like another few months left of this, by the way. It's like all fizzling away for them. They're still going to have the Nintendo Quarterlies, which are coming up, where they'll be able to talk about how it shipped more than the Switch 1 in that same time window, even though the Switch 1 will have outsold it. But they're going to cling on to the Quarterlies for as long as they can until that eventually balances out. And then they're going to shift from there, and if they're lucky, Nintendo will have shipped worldwide numbers that are still ahead of the Switch 1, so they'll be pointing at the worldwide numbers instead of just hyper-focusing on the US or Europe, because Europe is already showing much worse signs of a slowdown than they are in the States. So the idea is they'll always have something to cling onto for the next few months, but it's not that far away. Eventually it catches up. Or it could all potentially end much earlier than that if Nintendo just does a price drop. These next 3 months are going to be massive for the States. This whole January that we just passed through, February and March following that. Because there is nothing over these next 3 months. Like their big movie game that they're releasing for Mario is Super Mario Wonder. So unless they magically pull out a 3D Mario or a 3D Zelda or a Smash Brothers in the next 3 months, which I personally think is very unlikely, January, February, and March have to be scrutinized in incredible detail. But I am fairly confident the numbers that are going to be shared are going to be very vague from Circana. We're gonna really have to dig around to figure out just how poorly it's doing during those 3 months. That's what happened back in September, that's what happened in November, even December technically. Matt Piscatello did not share the amount of units that were sold in December and November, and I think the only place where he actually shared numbers that were sold was back in October when they sold 328,000 units, because that was considered impressive for an October. And he's going to end up doing something similar over the next few months, maybe combining the numbers with the Switch 1, maybe once again comparing it to the PlayStation 4, because we know that the PlayStation 4 is not going to catch up to the Switch 2 anytime soon if you align the launches, because the PS4 holiday season is quite a ways away. So he'll find ways to deliver the news in order to make Nintendo Nintendo look as best as possible. But effectively, that price drop is completely reliant on Nintendo's willingness to take a risk. They took one in time for the holidays. The Circana numbers came out yesterday. They got a bit of a bounce in the stock market, but not really that much. It's still way down in comparison to its all-time high back in August. So I don't know, maybe Nintendo's just like, we're gonna wait until February 4th when the quarterlies come out. It's gonna show how much units that were sold in. People are gonna wrongfully assume that the Switch 2 has already sold like 17 million to customers. We'll see if that makes the stock market bounce back up to August heights, because back in September when it hit 10 million sell-in shipped units, it still did not get back up to the August heights. And actually on the contrary, over a span of the next few months, it dropped back down to the lowest it's been in a year. So I don't know, maybe they have high hopes for like how the stock is gonna look after their February quarterlies, and they're like, okay, if we can ride that wave, get to that number, please the shareholders, we don't need to do a price drop, we can kind of continue as is. But that's why we're going to continue to focus on the sales numbers, because you can only hide it for so long. They had a very rocky November and December, 35% down in comparison to the Switch 1. I can only imagine what January is going to look like in comparison to other Januaries in the US. There hasn't been any discounts this month, by the way. It's been 23 days of January so far. And January already is a pretty big slow month, so it could be very interesting to see just how much slower it is. You might have to look back to the Wii U and compare it to that to make it feel like it's a success. But we're going to be a ways away until we get that information, and by then the February quarterlies will have come out on February 4th. That's when everyone's going to flood this channel again and talk about how great it's doing because of the high sell-in numbers, which means shipped. But then not too long after that, on February 20th, we'll be right back here again, talking about how the Switch 2 just had an abysmal January. And obviously, I'm not going anywhere. I will be here every step of the way. Thank you for listening, and I will catch you on the next one.